Hi, everybody, and welcome back to my leadership podcast. It's been an eventful time for me, so I realized that I have not been on every week as I normally would be, but a lot has happened. I got engaged to my sweetheart, Tillman, got to see our grandchildren in Ontario, and got to hold a lovely 2-month-old, my grandson. Dearly love my family, and it was wonderful to get to spend time with them and hang out with my almost 3-year-old granddaughter as well. It's an amazing time of getting to deepen connections and place intent going forward with my fiance. And yesterday I turned 60. So lots of milestones in the last couple of weeks. Which brings me to the topic for today of leadership at home. How do we bring that sense of leadership to our home environment? And we can apply this to how we relate to our partners, how we relate to our children as we're raising them. Leadership is very much about helping everybody in the situation to shine, everybody to reach their highest potential. So as leaders, we really have to ask ourselves, am I leading from a place of example? Don't want to be those people who say, do as I say, not as I do. So when we think about the qualities we want to inspire in our children and in our partners, are we living to our highest aim? Are we being the best we can be? One of the things I dearly love about my relationship with Tillman is that we will notice if we think that one of us isn't aiming as high as we could, and we'll talk about it and talk about what would be the highest aim. How can we be the best people we can be? And we fully support each other in that. So I think part of being a leader is being willing to take that constructive input and look at, could I do better? Could I reach higher? How am I showing up today? Am I showing up as the best person I can possibly be? And to serve as inspiration for each other. And it's the same with our children. Are we actively looking for ways to reflect the real world to them? When I disciplined my children, and none of us are perfect parents, we're all doing the best we can. And I certainly faced a lot of challenges as a single mother, because when my marriage ended, I was raising 4 children between the ages of 4 and 9 on my own. Not an easy task. But what I strived to do was to reflect the real world back to them. So in disciplining, I always looked for what would happen in the world if this behavior occurred. If somebody's not following through on what they need to do, what are the consequences that would reasonably be had? So I think that's a really important component, because we are preparing them to operate in the real world. So for example, if your kid isn't following through on a task they need to accomplish, if there's a privilege that's being removed, is it equivalent to what would be removed out in the world if they were doing a job and they weren't following through on what was expected of them? And can we also notice those ways that we can offer praise, but not over offering it? You don't want your child living for praise. You really want to imbue in them the satisfaction of a job well done, satisfaction they feel within themselves at having succeeded. One of the biggest challenges that I encounter for people who come to me in my practice as a psychic coach is setting good boundaries. So if we are doing everything for our children, then they might go out into the world without the skills of knowing how to do basic things like grocery shop, do laundry, pick up after themselves. It's a challenge because we want to, our instinct is to keep our children from harm, keep them from feeling pain, and yet discomfort, loss, disappointment, delayed gratification are some of the most necessary things we can offer them. And we can do it with respect. When my children were young, if I was speaking to an adult and they wanted to interrupt, I would ask them to wait a moment. And then whichever one of us was speaking, when we finished that sentence or thought, I would then turn to my child and say, and what is it you wanted to say? Sometimes that meant interrupting the adult I was speaking with, because I wanted to make it clear that we were pausing the conversation to acknowledge my child who had something to say. We weren't letting them interrupt, but we were making sure they got to speak, and then we could return to our conversation. Respect goes both ways. So I always strove to respect where my children were coming from. And did I always succeed? No. But I always did my best to come from that place of looking at how do I want to model for them how they show up in the world. So when it comes to setting boundaries, it can be making sure that they know how to do basic things. A toddler can fold laundry. Children from a pretty young age can be told that, you need to put your toys in that box now because we're going to go do something else. So that needs to be done first. And the other thing you were about to do doesn't happen until they've completed that task. And that can be hard when kids are young and they don't always have a lot of patience, and we don't always have a lot of patience. But we can start with those simple things. And young children tend to want to help. We want to encourage that. So part of our leadership at home is to make sure that everybody is part of the team that organizes the household. Everybody's pitching in and doing what they need to do. And from a pretty young age, we can start encouraging children to make their own decisions, encouraging them to choose what they're going to wear that day, giving them choices. I always suggest don't give too many choices. Usually 2 or 3 options are the best, because you're also working with a young child who, shouldn't have too many demands made on their developing brain to make a wide range of decisions, because that becomes frustrating for them. So what I used to do with my kids is say, these are your choices. And if you don't make one of these choices, I will make an executive decision. So in other words, they were given an opportunity to have some leadership, but within limits, because that's what they're going to encounter in the work world, short of running their own company. And they're still going to have to follow the rules of commerce and society. They're going to make decisions within a confined framework. And if they don't make the decision they're given, decisions will be made for them. And that's how the world works. We want our children to make good choices. We want to teach them early how to do that, but also show them there's consequences for not making a decision. Part of what's going to happen for us as leaders is we're going to make decisions that other people in our lives are uncomfortable with. And a lot of us are culturized to be everybody's emotional caretaker. So we tend to make decisions that don't rock the boat. The problem with that is we're essentially helping the people around us to stay asleep, because nobody grows inside their comfort zone. It's only when things are shaken up for us do we feel discomfort, look into why that discomfort exists, hopefully if we've learned to be introspective, and started to look at the patterns coming up for us. So as leaders, we can either say, my bad, I'll climb back in that little box we had me in so you're not uncomfortable. Or with the people we love, we might say, I see you're uncomfortable. I see you're struggling with the decision I'm making. How can I support you to work through your struggle? In other words, we don't own their struggle. We don't make it our problem. Because what's going to happen is, if you're listening to your inner voice, it's going to have you making choices that don't gel with everybody else's patterns. So their patterns are going to erupt, and those patterns are designed to try to put you back where you were in the scenario so that there's no discomfort, but then there's also no growth. So part of your being a leader, part of your learning to really listen to yourself and follow through on what your intuition tells you to do, is to accept there will probably be fallout at times. People around you will get disgruntled, will not be happy, will even question the decisions that you're making. I've been in situations in the past where I would go to make a decision and I would have a partner go, well, why are you doing that? And I think you should do this. And what I learned to do is to say, thank you for offering your opinion. I'll consider it, but ultimately this is my decision to make. And that's a really important distinction. Knowing when it's your decision. And if you're making a decision that doesn't have a direct consequence on anybody else, it's not really something you have to discuss. And sometimes we'll discuss something with somebody hoping they'll be our cheerleader. But if that's not what they normally do, if they normally are the cautionary voice that holds us back because the concern isn't really based in reality, then we might hold ourselves back because, well, that person doesn't think I should do this, so I'm not going to try. And yet, to step into the unknown, to grow, we're probably going to make decisions other people aren't going to be comfortable with. And if we're going to be leaders, sometimes we're going to have to step into that discomfort of upsetting other people. There are going to be times that you're going to say no to your children, and they're going to be deeply unhappy about it. And they're going to throw all of that emotion at you. They might tell you they hate you. So be it. You're here to make sure they can function in the real world. And they're going to be told no. They're going to encounter disappointment. And if they don't know how to deal with that rationally, if they haven't learned that people are not going to stand for that kind of pushback, they're going to have a hard time out in the real world. So as a leader, you can learn to hold space for that. You can learn to say, I see you're upset. It's okay that you're upset, but these are the actions you can't take because you have those feelings. You're going to have those feelings and accept the situation. And that's one of the first things we learn in the world is we don't have control over things. There's things that are going to happen in our life that we're not going to like. And we're going to have to learn to move through that with some grace and acceptance. And working with your partner and you are not always going to be on the same page. You're not always going to agree. Sometimes you're going to have to concede a situation that is very important to them, that they really need things to move a certain way. And you might have to concede. There may be other times where you're really clear that your path is taking you in a certain direction, and you need to discuss that with your partner and find a middle ground where you can both continue to move toward your aim in a way that reflects both of your needs. That kind of discussion is really important. But it has to come from a place of mutual leadership, where you really respect where they're coming from. There's respect for where you're coming from. And you're both speaking your mind, sharing your truth, and coming to a conclusion that might not be fully satisfactory, but keeps you both moving in the same direction. And where your kids are concerned, it's not an easy world to function in if you've been sheltered. Quite a few years ago, there was a show on CBC, and it was called Hyper-Parenting and Coddled Kids. And they were talking about how all these young people were going to university and getting on anxiety meds and talking to counselors because they literally did not know how to function on their own. They had never been taught. So from the time your child is quite young, help them find their inner leadership with situations where they're not going to come to harm, Give them the opportunity to make decisions for themselves, and don't shield them from the consequences. If they make a poor decision, don't bail them out. I've seen people do that. I've seen them make excuses when their kid doesn't show up in time for something. And they find a reason why that's okay. Somebody else was at fault, instead of saying, you should have been on time, and now there's a consequence because of that. If they get the consequences early in life, when they're less devastating, they're not going to have to be devastated as much later on in life. And they'll have the inner tools to work with to be able to say, I'm accountable for my actions. I take responsibility for them, and I will then make whatever corrections are necessary. We want them to have those tools, which means we have to let them be accountable at a young age. And that means being willing to say, do you see what happened in this situation? Do you see where making a different choice earlier might have led to a different result? What do you think you should do next time? Ask them the questions rather than just tell them how to operate in the world. And realize they're going to have a different perspective. I remember being in my mid-30s, telling one of my teenage sons why he should do something a particular way. And then I had this little awakening, and I went to myself, why would I expect him at 17 to see things the way I do in my mid-30s? So I ended up saying to him, as your mother, I have to make this decision. And he rolled his eyes, and I said, and as my teenage son, I expect you to do that. And he laughed, because the pressure had been taken off of him to be okay with the decision I was making. I was probably setting a curfew of some kind. And that's part of it, is allowing them to have their feelings about the rules that you set for them. They don't have to like it. They just have to follow through or incur the consequences of not doing so. Take as much as you can the emotion out of your leadership decisions at home. I would say to my kids, this isn't personal. This is how life works. This is what will happen out in the real world if you take this action or non-action, as it were, if you don't follow through on something. As much as possible, be their guide for how the world is going to operate and how it's going to react to them. It's going to give them a much better opportunity to go out there knowing they already have some tools. There's enough stuff they're going to have to learn on their own without your guidance. But guide as much as you can at home. Know that you're going to make mistakes because you're human. Be willing to apologize, because that also lets them know it's okay to be human and how to be accountable. And just get up the next day and do the best you can. We can be really, really hard on ourselves as parents, to the point that we can let go of our leadership role at home. And when kids are, given a rule or a boundary, and then they cross it and there's no consequence, then they learn that you're really not aiming in that high direction. You're malleable in terms of the rules that you're setting, and therefore they're going to think that that's true out in the world. They're going to challenge all the rules out there, and sometimes that's going to have consequences for them. They might lose jobs, they might lose relationships, because they decided to challenge things. And we want our kids to think for themselves. We want them to check in with themselves and say, is this something that is reasonable? Am I in a job where what's being asked of me is reasonable? Am I in a relationship where what's being asked is reasonable? But if they just come out of their childhood thinking, I can break the rules and get away with it, that's not going to serve them. They're not going to understand they operate within a society. And that's a big part of our job, is to reflect society back to them. You might have these desires, you might have these interests, and that's fine, but you have to operate within the society. So learn the rules. And sometimes maybe you will have to break a rule. Maybe that rule isn't fair or reasonable, but then be willing to be accountable and accept the consequences of that. The mavericks, the inventors, the innovators often do break the rules. They often find a way to step into new territory. But sometimes they face challenges from society as a result. If your kids have a reasonable understanding about how society works and the consequences of stepping out of that realm, and they've learned how to listen to themselves because you've helped them learn how to check in and make good decisions, then they're going to accept, okay, that's a challenge, but it's a challenge I'm willing to accept and step through. And they'll become leaders themselves. Because ultimately, that's what we want, is for our kids to find their own inner leadership and learn early in life how to make those choices. So, for example, when my kids were young and they said, we were having talks about sex, how old do I have to be to have sex? And I said, old enough to take care of any children that come of that, because that's what sex does. And it's such an interesting way of looking at it, because now it's saying, if you're going to be an adult and you're going to take care of children, you have to have a job. Now there's all these other things to think about if you choose to take that action. Again, it's looking at the consequences. One can get into morality and all of those things, but if you just look at the simple consequences of an action, now your kid gets to think about, is that a consequence I'm willing to take on? Drug use is another one. If you take a drug, that drug is now taking you on a journey and you don't have any say over that. It's going to take you wherever it's going to take you. And there might be a crash after that high. So if you make that choice, understand you're giving up control. You're giving up the ability to be discerning and make better decisions while you're under that influence. There's so many ways that we can be a positive influence. And there's also the fact that we have to accept that our children are going to go out into the world. They're going to make their own choices. And that may or may not lead to fulfillment for us as parents. And that's also part of our job. If our children go out into the world and they decide that we're not going to be a part of it anymore, we have to accept that. Our job is to bring them into the world, set them on the best path we can, and let go. So we may have some of our children who, stay lifelong in our lives, and other ones who may not. I think a big part of parenting is accepting our children have their own path, and we have the privilege of walking alongside them for a while, offering them what we can, hoping that they learn what they can from us, and maybe improve on what we've offered, and that they keep growing forward, whether they include us or not. Our job is to keep working on ourselves, to keep stepping into our spiritual leadership, and allow for the people and the situations around us to shift as they will. And let go of trying to control for that. That's another big part of parenthood. I vowed to myself that once my children left home, I was no longer going to parent them without their permission. I'm always available. I'm always available if they want to come to me with questions, they want advice on something. I do my best not to offer it without it being asked for. So if they are bringing up a situation or a concern, I might say, may I offer my perspective? And if they say, no, I want to figure this out myself, so be it. We're here to be supportive of them, but we can't walk their path for them. So a big part of leadership is offer what you can and then let go. The rest is up to them. And that frees up your energy to continue to support other people in your life, in your community, other people who cross your path. And that's, again, a continuing of work on yourself, offer, and let go. Think about, as you go forward into this week, Where is your leadership flowing freely? You're working on your stuff. You're listening to yourself. You're offering in the moment what you feel you're meant to. And then you're letting go of the consequences and accepting if there's a flow back to you that's consequential, you will be accountable for that. And then look at those times where you have such an invested interest in the outcome that you're really trying to push for that. You'll know because you'll feel the tension in your body. You'll feel that powerful desire to control the situation. See how much you can step into flow, which is so much more gentle and actually allows you to have more energy to operate where you're supposed to, which may be a broader range of interaction than when you're just trying to drill down into one situation that you may be trying to control so you don't have to deal with your core patterns that are coming up. That's a really key part of this. If your stuff is being triggered, are you sitting with it? Are you working on it? Or are you trying to get that other person in your life to be different so you don't have to have those feelings? Ponder that. I'll look forward to seeing you next week.